Well, thanks for being here today, everyone. This is the Landlord 101 class for the Housing Solutions Network. I want to thank them for their work trying to address housing needs in Jefferson County. My name is Barney Burke. I'm a longtime mom and pop landlord. Done that for a long time in Port Townsend, about 20 years. But in my past, I was a city planner and economic development person. I did a lot of work on affordable housing and local government. I got a lot of housing built, got housing preserved. Done a lot of work on housing policy at the local level, so it's fun to come in and talk about how we can address affordable housing with rental units here in Jefferson County. I did read all of the questions and comments that people had on their registration form. That was really helpful. And I think they kind of fall into three categories. One is people looking for general tips and best practices on how to be a landlord. The second was, how do you deal with difficult tenants? What about evictions and things of that nature? And the third is people that just want to address the needs in our community, do something about housing. So that's great. And thanks to Zoom, questions get typed in, and it saves distraction when you're the one up here looking at your notes, that there'll be questions coming up from the audience. So let's talk about rental housing needs and opportunities in Jefferson County. We have a very, very low vacancy rate for housing in Jefferson County. You can tell by, you look at the newspaper, there's maybe one or two listings at any given time. That's really low. And overall, our housing stock has a really low vacancy rate, in part because of vacation users, Airbnb and that sort of thing, and second homes. So there isn't much housing that's available for people, and certainly not much rental housing available. So that's part of the reason our housing is so expensive here. One of the good things, though, is in Port Townsend, there's about 5,300 dwelling units. About 700 of those are subsidized in one way or another by various nonprofit or government programs. But even with that, there's an unmet need, particularly for rental housing. And there's a need for smaller units and more multifamily units, because those are less expensive to produce and therefore more affordable to people who need them. The challenge is it's really hard to build affordable housing in much volume in a place like this. Infrastructure is a big challenge. All the pipes and paving and things that are needed for you to put up a building is pretty expensive. The city of Port Townsend has waived some development fees. They've given tax breaks. They've extended infrastructure. Those things are all helpful. But I think the low-hanging fruit is things like ADUs, accessory dwelling units, basement apartments, tiny homes, sheds, seasonal homes that aren't being used, that could be used some of the year for rental. Those are all the easier opportunities. And for anyone who's thinking of buying their first home, or if you know someone buying their first home, something you might want to think about is, could you create a second unit there that would both create an affordable unit for someone else, as well as make it easier for you to purchase that first home, because you'd have that additional income. That's certainly how I bought my first house, and I think it's still a good idea today. And this seminar today is on what we call Landlord 101, how to be a good landlord. We're working on another webinar, would be how to create that second unit. Like if you have a house that has room for a basement apartment, how do you go about doing that? And what are some of the success stories that people might be able to share locally on that? So with that, let's meet our neighbors, the renters. And I find it frustrating sometimes that everybody, including landlords, engages in these negative stereotypes about people that rent. Or you hear people say things like, oh, I would be okay with a senior rental complex in my neighborhood, but not one that had families or other people. And I think, what are we talking about? These are just people like the rest of us. And if you look around, 1 in 3 people in our community at any given time is a renter. It depends on the stage of life that you're in, or you just moved here, or you're saving up money for a house or whatever. So all these people need places to live. In the landlord business, people ask me about this. Well, what are some of the financial goals and rewards, and what are also some of the risks in doing that? And like I said, I've done this a long, long time on a small scale as a mom and pop landlord. And I've always looked at the goal as similar to having an IRA retirement account. In the early years, you're shoveling many dollars every month into that investment, but towards the end, you will have a nest egg for your retirement. It will be a good investment in the long run. So the primary goal isn't a positive cash flow. And in an area like Jefferson County, it would be very hard to have a positive cash flow at the start of a unit that you just acquired and try to rent. But in the long term, it's a good investment that way. Now, there are some risks. You could have a bad tenant. You could have unforeseen problems with the building, like dry rot or foundation failure, what have you. You could have moratoriums. You could have earthquakes. You could have recessions. All kinds of things that could put your investment at risk. But I think that investing in rental housing is a good way to diversify your income. It's also, in my opinion, a lot safer than the Dow Jones, and it's something you can do just directly hands-on and help your own community. So I've enjoyed doing this for a long time, but it's good to ask yourself if you have what it takes to be a landlord. And, if you're not the kind of person that's handy, if you're not someone who can hang a set of blinds or change a cabinet hinge in a kitchen cabinet, maybe it's not for you. You really need to have some resilience, both financially and otherwise, just dealing with people and stuff that happens unexpectedly, and have that depth to deal with it. And I often say, if you've never used the phrase, "I'm glad you told me that," or "I'll be right over," then maybe you shouldn't be a landlord, because if you're in a service business, that's got to be your answer when someone calls and needs something. "I'll be right over." So let's talk about if you have a unit and how to market that in Jefferson County or anywhere else. If you Google things like how much should you charge for a rental, you'll find one of the myths on the internet that drives me crazy. You'll often see this myth of 1%. You paid so many dollars for a house, the rent should be 1% of that. Well, the starter home in Jefferson County right now is $350,000. I don't think anybody's going to pay $3,500 to rent a house in Jefferson County unless it's some spectacular waterfront estate that's furnished and so on. That starter home, it wouldn't even rent for $1,750, half of that amount, I would think. And of course, that amount is still more than what a lot of people in Jefferson County can afford. And if you were getting that 1% a month, that's a 12% annual return. And I can tell you that is a smoking big return on a real estate investment in the long term. So throw those myths and outdated rules of thumb out. Those are not valid. I think if you want to understand the local market, look at the listings every week. You get a better idea of what's available and what are apartments going for, what are different kinds of houses going for, and what locations. What is an ADU rent for, or a cottage, something like that. You can look at Zillow and Redfin, and there's another site called Rent-O-Meter, and gauge what is a rent for a particular property. But there are so few properties in our county, I think it's difficult for those sites to come up with really reliable numbers. So it's just good to keep an eye on the one hands that come in. So you can see on this chart we're putting up here is, what's an affordable rent. A good rule of thumb is most households can afford about 30% of their income for rent, 30% of the gross income. And on this chart here, you can see that a person making the median wage in Jefferson County, which is about $45,000 a year, they can afford a rent of about $1,132 a month. Someone making the average wage, which is about $39,000, can afford about $988 a month. A person making the minimum wage of $13.50 an hour could afford $702 a month. And of course, people that are making minimum wage are frequently going to pair up with a roommate or two to be able to make that. But I think the most useful number on this chart is looking at the median household income, because then you typically would have one or two or even three wage earners. Maybe one of them full-time or part-time, you don't know. But that number, the median household income, this is for 2018, is $54,500. So that's a really good measure. That median household can afford $1,362 a month. And of course, the problem with that is it's not enough to buy a house. It's also not quite enough to rent the average house. So this means that just about everybody in Jefferson County that's renting is paying more than what's considered an affordable rent, 30% of your income. So there's plenty of opportunity for people to go out there and help with that issue by, creating more units, whether they are second homes in your backyard or a basement apartment or something like that. Another way we help, though, is there's a program called Section 8. It's a federal housing program that's been around for a long time. I used to work, see, we got questions coming in. I used to work in this program years ago, And as you can imagine, there's many low and moderate income people that 30% of their income is not anywhere near enough to rent a unit. So what Section 8 does is it makes up the difference between what that person can pay at 30% and what a fair rent is. And you can see on this chart that the Section 8 program indicates that affordable rents start at $762 for a studio and go up to about $2,100 for a 5-bedroom unit. So if Mrs. Jones comes in and she's a widow on a pension, and she can afford $600 and she wants to rent that studio, the Section 8 program would pay the additional $162. So that's how that works. So these are just like any other tenant, but they don't have enough money to pay what the going rents are. The program in the Olympic Peninsula is run by the Peninsula Housing Authority out of Port Angeles. They serve Clallam and Jefferson counties. And about every year, every 6 months, maybe they'll do another lottery to pick people to receive these vouchers that people can go out and use to get housing. Now, the sad thing is about half the people who get a voucher don't end up finding a place to rent at all, even though they have that voucher. It'd be helpful. There just aren't enough places available. So that's an issue that it would be nice to address that. A couple of questions. Let's see. How easy is it to accept Section 8 vouchers? Does a landlord need to advertise accepting Section 8? It's pretty easy to be a landlord in that program. It's a federal program, but the housing authority is interested in getting people into units. There's a little bit of paperwork. There's an inspection before the place is rented, and there's an inspection when it's done, because these are tax dollars. We want to make sure that the people benefiting from the program are getting a decent, safe place to live, and so on. But it's really pretty easy, and I highly recommend having worked in it years ago and saw a lot of people benefit. Another question here, let's see. If you want to charge an affordable rent but don't know your tenant's income, how do you decide? Well, if I knew the income, I wouldn't make it lower or higher. I mean, maybe someone's. I think what most landlords do is what I do, which is you look at the unit and you figure out, what this unit should go for in the market. And I think most landlords, and I've done this for a long time, one of the most important things is charge a little bit less than the going rate, because that'll get you the best tenants that want to stay longer. There'll be less turnover, less chance of an eviction. Charge a little bit less than what you could be getting. It really makes sense in the long run. Now people often ask me, how do you find good tenants? And I always say, it's not that hard, particularly in a county where there's such a shortage of housing. Every time I have a vacancy, and I only have 3 units, my God, you'll get a dozen people the first day or two that want to rent that place. So there's plenty of good tenants out there, but there's 3 things you got to do. Number 1 is you got to advertise. And I always put an ad in the leader, because everybody looking for a place to rent is going to look at the leader on Wednesday. And I also put an ad in Craigslist. So the $20 you spend on the ad in the leader is just a really good investment in finding that good tenant. Now, I get some people that'll ask me, you advertise? Wow, my brother-in-law has a rental and he always does it word of mouth. And I always want to ask people, why? Is he trying to discriminate? You don't know who this person is who's the best tenant out there. You want to advertise and give everybody a chance to come look at it. And hopefully you'll find the best possible tenant. So it works for you, it works for them. So I always put an ad in. Charge a little bit less in the market is very important. And the other rule, it should go without saying, but it needs to be said, and that's no one wants to live in a dump, okay? And a few years back, I was renting this condominium I had, and this woman calls and she comes over to see it. She comes in, she's got this little baby under her arm, and I'll never forget this. She looks around the unit and checks out the bedrooms and come back, and she says, it's so clean. And I'm like, yeah, well, thanks. It's so clean. She says, no, we got this brand new baby and we're looking for a place to live. We're moving from Oregon, and a little baby's going to crawl around on the carpet. And we look at all these places that are dumps. And she was, can I rent this place? I said, well, I always ask for an application first to do a background check. I'll never forget this. Had the form, got on the kitchen counter. She's holding the kid and I'm holding the form, and she's filling that thing out. And I thought, this is going to be a great tenant. You just know sometimes. And this person, she'd been looking, and, man, how many other people could have rented a place to her if they had it a little cleaner, had paid attention to things that don't cost a lot of money. Later in the seminar, we'll talk about some of those low-cost things that make your unit something that everybody likes to have, whether they're owning that house or whether they're renting it. These are great things that you should do to get your tenants to say, oh, I want to rent this place. So let's talk about screening tenants. And the most important thing with that is the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed in the 1960s. It protects certain classes of people from discrimination in housing, whether it's rental or ownership housing. Those classes are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and familial status. Now, I will point out there is a loophole in this law that perhaps was necessary to get the votes to pass it. If a landlord has 3 or fewer units and there's no professional real estate agents or management companies involved, and there's no advertising of the unit, it's technically exempt from the Fair Housing Act. Now, don't get ahead of me here because discrimination is wrong. And fortunately, in Washington, 15 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress, the state of Washington established the Washington Human Rights Commission. I'll even give you their phone number. It's 800-233-3247. 800-233-3247. I mention that because they're a good resource if you're a tenant and feel you've been discriminated against. They love when they get calls from landlords who say, hey, I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. Can you give me some tips? Does my lease look okay to you? Am I following the right practices? They want to help landlords that call. So they're a really good resource. So in addition to the classes that are protected in the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Washington law also protects against discrimination on the basis of creed, sexual orientation, gender identification, veteran or military status, or marital status. So all those additional protections are in there. And I would note that there's an exception in the Washington law for home sharing. And what home sharing means is if you have a house or an apartment, and whether you own it or whether you rent it, and you want to take on a roommate to split the bills or whatever, those discrimination practices do not apply to that. Now, it would apply if you had a basement apartment that has a separate unit. You cannot discriminate with that. But with your own unit, so say you're a woman looking for a roommate in this house that you're renting, you can say, yes, I'm going to rent to another woman. You can do that. So, but overall, it's a very helpful law in Washington to prevent discrimination. And despite that, though, in the 20 years I've been doing this in Port Townsend, I'm always amazed at how much discrimination is out there, right out in the open. I've had phone calls from people who said, oh, you have a unit available. I know this person might want to rent it. Oh, great. And they'll start talking about this person, and they'll say something like, oh, and by the way, he's black. And I'm like, don't tell me that. I don't discriminate. Or they'll say, gee, this person is gay. I hope that doesn't bother you. No, it doesn't bother me. What bothers me is we will not discriminate, and that's against the law. I won't do it. Don't tell me that information. Just give me their phone number, or you give them my phone number. I'd be happy to show them the unit. But that sort of casual discrimination goes on quite a bit. The other thing I've run into, I was renovating a place after someone moved out, a family moved out of there, and they had a couple of young kids. And this neighbor comes over and says, oh, please don't rent to another family. And I'm like, you're asking me to break the law. This is the law of the land. It's also our state law, but think about it. Where do children live? If you didn't rent to families that had children, are they all going to be out in the street, or we're going to rent to people that have children? But this kind of thing goes around all the time, and I just want to make people aware of that is wrong, and it's just, it's easy enough to do the right thing. So let's see, a couple of questions here. Can you limit how many people live in your unit? Yes, but it can't be arbitrary. A real common standard that's used in housing codes throughout the country is a standard of 2 people per bedroom. So if someone had a 1-bedroom unit, you could say, oh yeah, this is suitable for 2 people. But be careful when you advertise it. Don't say 1-bedroom unit ideal for elderly couple, or 1-bedroom people unit would be perfect for a young couple. No. Just say it's a 1-bedroom unit. Let the people come look at it, because hey, it might be a parent and a child. It might be 2 unrelated people, whatever. So yeah, you can limit the number, but be careful how you do that so you're not discriminating. And this is a good question. What changes do you need to make if a disabled person applies and they need a ramp or something? So here's how the State Landlord Tenant Act works on that. If a person with disabilities needs to put in ramps and hand bars in certain improvements like that, they're entitled to do that at their expense and then remove them and restore the property when they leave. Of course, my advice would be if you don't have grab bars in your shower now, put them in anyway at your expense. I mean, I've done some bathroom renovations, built some walk-in showers in houses, and always put in one of those grab bars around, because even, in fact, one that we did, no sooner did we did that, but the tenant got a broken ankle. So it was really fortuitous that we put a grab bar in there, because while he recovered from the broken ankle, it was helpful, but it's helpful for everyone to do that. Now, the law is a little different if you're building a new multifamily project. In that instance, in Washington State, there's a requirement that a certain percentage of the units have additional handicap facilities, or disabled, like kitchen countertops that can be lowered or raised. But if you have an existing unit, the things that would typically a tenant would be entitled to put in would be, ramps, door hardware, grab bars in the shower, things like that. So that's a good thing to do. Okay, and you can see this is a sample application for rent. I think it's a good idea to always have people fill out an application, because then you know who you're dealing with. You can see on there, oh, where do you work? Where was the last place you lived? And so on. Put all those questions in there to do a background check. And I think the most useful thing in selecting a tenant is find that they have a good record of renting places in the past, and that they have a good employment record. Somebody stable and so on. But I never ask for social security numbers. Long before ID theft became a thing, I stopped asking for social security. I just think it's too invasive and it's not really helpful. I also don't ask for credit reports. I don't ask for income. I mean, if someone says, hey, I work at Safeway or I work at the mill, I have an idea how much money you're making. I don't need to be so invasive to know all of that. And I don't ask for arrest records. I think that tends to be an unfair thing to ask. I do want to ask about felonies, though, and see if there's an issue there. Maybe this is a long time ago. Is there a pattern? What's going on? Because you want to make sure, who you're renting to. You want to be careful about this, not just to protect your unit and have a sense that it's going to work well financially, but I'm no fan of insurance companies, but there's this database called CLUE, the Comprehensive Loss Underwriters Exchange. So if you ever have a claim, either as a homeowner or as a landlord, it goes on there. So the last thing you want is someone that goes in and causes a big insurance claim. Next time you get insurance, it may be more difficult or more expensive. So you really want to think about that kind of stuff down the road. And in terms of doing the background check, in terms of arrest records, or I should say criminal records, there's a Washington State court site that's on the syllabus. It's a pretty clunky site. You have to look county by county, and in each county there's civil, there's criminal, there's district court, there's superior court. So it's a little bit tedious to go through it, but it's a way to identify any cases that actually had a court record or something happened, and you can then determine if it's relevant or not. I had this one applicant. She seemed like she would be a great tenant. I met her. She had a cute little kid, and she had a good employment. She worked somewhere in town a long time. And I looked at her criminal record. My God, she had all these cases in district court for bad checks, and then she had cases in superior court. If you have bad check cases in superior court, that's a felony. You're a bad check writer. I called her up and I said, I'm not renting to you. I don't mind fixing toilets in the middle of the night, this and that, but I will not chase after someone who writes bad checks. So that's a really relevant thing to check out. And then a lot of people ask about sex offenders. Every county in Washington, the local sheriff has a sex offender registry. It's on the county website. And if someone is just moving here from another county, they have to register here, but you might want to check in the county they're moving from to see if there's an issue there or not. And then what else? I do ask about evictions and bankruptcies. Those are certainly not deal breakers for me. I mean, someone might say, gee, me and my wife we just both lost our jobs and we got evicted. Gee, I'm sorry to hear that. I understand, and that's in the past. Or you get someone who's gone through bankruptcy. Frequently, those are people who've been dealing with a medical emergency and so on. I'm just trying to get a sense of where people are in their life. Is their life in free fall, or they're going to be able to come in here and pay the rent if they take the place. So those are most of the, there's more background. These are good background questions. Is it okay to ask an applicant, what do they plan to rent full-time versus using it as a vacation rental for occasional use? I'm not aware of any prohibition about asking that, and you may think, gee, I've got this unit to rent. Would it be more helpful to my community if this is a person who's moving here to take a job, or is this a person who's moving here for another reason? You know, it's up to you to decide. So you can certainly ask that. Yeah, people ask this, is the best factor for screening tenants their credit line? I don't think so. And I stopped asking for that kind of stuff years ago. But like I said, I want to make sure I know, hey, they've been working somewhere for a long time. Their current landlord will give them a good reference. And I think those are the most helpful things. Let's see. People ask about application fees. It's legal, but it's a racket. If I was in charge, no one would charge application fees. Can you imagine you being someone trying to save up your first and last month's rent and a deposit to rent a place? And with housing so tight, you might look at 5 or 10 units before you finally find one that you manage to get picked as the tenant. How much money that would cost? Is it $25 a pop, $50 a pop? I just think that's outrageous. And you think of the ethics of it. If I already got 5 applicants and then this person comes in, do I collect another $25 knowing full well I'm only renting to one person? I just think that's unconscionable. And so I never charge application fees. I think it's wrong. And my philosophy is that the person who generates the profit for my business is the person who leases that unit. No one else should be paying for the being able to apply for that. Just the tenant pays. So I think that's something that should go by the wayside. But let's talk about what is a fair way to select among qualified tenants. I feel strongly about this. I've done it in a very rigorous way for many, many years because, like I say, I've worked in housing and affordable housing issues at community level, and so I'm real sensitive to how to be as fair as possible, particularly when you get 5 or 10 people, and each of them certainly qualified people and really need a place right now. My first rule is there's no sneak peeks. If somebody's moved out and I'm working on that unit for a couple of weeks, I may have it torn up because I'm changing the paint or I'm repairing the wall, I got the refrigerator pulled out. I don't want anybody to come and look at that place until it's perfect because I want to make the best impression. But I also want to prevent anyone from thinking, well, I saw it 2 weeks ago, so I'm somehow first in line or something. Can't stand that, especially when there's such a demand, people all want to rent it. So my rule has always been I don't select a tenant to the end of the second day of advertising. So the leader, of course, comes out on Wednesday. So Thursday, close of business, is the time I plan to choose a tenant. It gives me enough time to do some background checks and so forth. It's also a fairness issue. And you may be aware that Seattle has this well-intended, but I think very harmful and dumb law that the first qualified tenant shall get the unit. Let me tell you something. $5 says, under that scenario, the first person is a white male. $5 says the first person is a white male with plenty of money, and that white male, someone who's in control of his own schedule. On a first come, first serve, the first applicant is rarely going to be a single parent. It's rarely going to be someone who works 2 big jobs. It's rarely going to be someone who's disabled. It's rarely going to be someone who lacks their own transportation, needs a ride, or has to take the bus to get there. So that is so unfair to say the first person that can be there at 8 in the morning should get the unit when somebody else is just coming home from the night shift or taking their kid to school or to daycare or whatever they're doing. I sent a letter to the Seattle Times on that a year ago, and they published it. And the example I gave in there, that I think really drives the point home, although Seattle hasn't changed their law, is some years back I had a house I was renting, and this applicant came in. It was someone I knew, and she came there with her 2 children. And it was apparent that, she'd been crying and she'd been beaten and needed a new place to live. And under the Seattle law, I wouldn't be able to consider her. That just seems incredibly unfair. Now, she didn't end up applying, but the principle is the same. Give everybody a chance. Why should it be so difficult to consider the different tenants? Because people have different situations. A lot of people certainly need housing, including someone who's in a crisis. So, let's see. The state law requires you to tell applicants what your criteria is for selecting a tenant. So I put that, you can see it on my application form. It says, my criteria is, good record of past tenancy and ability to pay. Pretty simple. And you must also tell people if you turn them down, why you're turning them down. And typically for me, I only had one place and there's 9 or 10 applicants, and that's the reason. But I would emphasize that, finding and retaining a great tenant is more important than getting the maximum rent. It really is. And that's why you don't want to start at the top of the market. You want to get a little bit below there. Get that person who's going to take care of the place, less turnaround, which is very expensive, and fewer evictions. So let's talk about leasing. And this gives you just a cover page of the RCW 59, the Washington Landlord Tenant Law. There's lots of details in there on different things. One of the basic points is how long are residential leases? An ordinary residential lease is anywhere from 2 months to 12 months. You can't be longer than that, and shorter than that would be what's called a month-to-month tenancy. So what people typically do is sign a 1-year lease, and then they have a holdover provision, which means at the end of 1 year, the landlord and tenant can consent to continue on a month-to-month basis, or you could sign a whole new lease, whether it's 6 months or 12 months or whatever. But I would note that in the Washington law, for a rent increase, you have to give a 60-day notice. So let's say you had a tenant there for a year, and now you're on a month-to-month. Effectively, each month you're saying, you want to go another month? Oh yeah, I'll go another, here's another check. And then you say, oh, we're going to raise the rent by $50. Well, you can't, even though it's on a 30-day basis, you still have to wait 60 days to raise the rent. That's just a minor point, but it's a good one to keep in mind that you want to follow these things in the state law. And just as a suggestion about rent increases, I have these tenants have been there for a very long time at one of my places, and they are on fixed incomes. They're seniors in their 70s and 80s. And here's how we do the rent increase for that place. Every year we look at these 3 indexes of inflation. We look at the Consumer Price Index. Google that. It's the U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it can tell you from month to month or year to year what the inflation rate has been. So that's one number. And then we look at the Social Security COLA, cost of living allowance, which is published every fall for the following year for Social Security. And the third thing we look at is property tax. And I know you won't believe me, but there are some years when your property tax actually goes down and not up, but that's a different webinar. But you want to look at that and see how much has that increased. And we take those 3 percentages and figure out which one was the lowest increase. We multiply that times the current rent and round it off to the nearest $25. So if they're paying $1,000 a month and there's a 2% inflation rate, that's $20. We would raise that to $25 to round that off. And I think that's been a very fair way to do it. And there was a question. Let me see here. Thank you. Yeah, so if a lease is up, can you make people move out? Is that an eviction or not? Yeah, if you sign a lease, let's say for a year, you're not obligated to sign another lease with that person. You're not obligated to let it go to a month-to-month situation. You're not obligated to do that. And of course, it's helpful to, well in advance of that time, have a discussion with the tenant. I usually do make sure I plan to stay around, or if I'm thinking I should increase the rent, I want to talk to them in advance so they can think about that. So don't spring it on the last minute that you're not going to re-sign the lease, but you're not required to let that person stay there. Or it would be very important that if you have a pattern of not letting people color sign new leases or not letting families, or whatever the reason might be, it can't be a discriminatory thing, but you are not obligated to continue renting to that same person. And if they didn't move out, you could evict them, much as that is an unpleasant thing to do. Here's a good question. How do you handle a lease violation? It's one of those all-in-one questions. Like, how do you deal with things in life? You try to scale and tailor your response to like the magnitude of that situation. I always say no smoking and no pets. And if you happen to be there one day and you see there's cigarette butts out front, I would certainly mention it, and I might follow up in an email, because it's always good to document if you had an issue, that when it happened and what was done about it. And because if you come to clean up that unit when the person moves out and there's a bunch of cigarette burns on the counter, you're going to want to be reimbursed for that. And you say, gee, we talked about this, there's no smoking. But you don't want to be too heavy-handed about it either. But there are some things, like if you found there was a lot of damage to the place for whatever may have happened, or particularly if there's hazardous materials being stored there. I remember a news story in San Francisco a few years back where a small 2 or 3 unit apartment building blew up. Someone was storing fireworks in it, and it blew up. So those are things that, to me are very serious. So, you get this out of here, right now. And if you don't, you got to move out. You just, so if people are storing, dangerous materials, you don't want harm coming from that. So kind of scale it to what the situation is. So let's see. Talk about leases. You've got my sample lease there. You can see it on the screen. I'm not an attorney, of course. You need to take a look at that as information and see how you might do things differently. We'll talk about a couple of things you generally cannot put in the lease. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, landlord and tenant agree that we're going to waive blah, blah. No, you can't just agree that the state law doesn't apply, even though the tenant and landlord agree that. Can't do that. You should stay away also from trying to say that if there's a lawsuit that the prevailing party will get certain damages, because that's actually prescribed by state law. And in many cases, it's ultimately the judge who's deciding, yes, there'll be attorney's fees and that person will decide what it is. You don't put that in the lease. That's something that the law already takes care of. There's other things that shouldn't be in leases. You're going to have a few opinions on things that I think of as rackets. The other big racket in the rental business is lockout fees. Who hasn't ever locked themselves out of a home? And I think those are just a racket. And I'll tell you the story. This guy was moving into unit. It's actually the husband of the young woman with the baby. They were moving up from Oregon. So she gets the place. She goes back to Oregon. The husband comes up with the moving van, been driving all day, gets here at 8 o'clock at night. My phone rings. He says, hey, this is Joe. I'm here with the moving van. I forgot the key. So what did I say? What's the magic words? I'll be right there. Never mind what I'm in the middle of. He's just driven 12 hours to get here. I think I'll head over and let him in. And so I get over there and get him a new key. And he's been driving all day, and he's got the moving van out there, got the back would open, and he's got this motorcycle in the back. I said, hey, you need a hand getting that motorcycle? Yeah. So I help him lower the bike into the garage and stuff, because, I think the secret to being a landlord and many other things in life is investing in relationships and not nickel and diming people. And, the funny thing is a couple of years later, this guy, he was a great cook and a great barbecuer. And one day he had the barbecue a little bit too close to the vinyl siding and did some damage. And not the end of the world, but that particular vinyl siding is no longer manufactured. But that guy went to the end of it and found a supplier that still had some new old stock of that vinyl siding, got it. And I think just an example, if you treat other people right, they will treat you right. And I just think it's so important. Thank you. So none of those, lockout fees, that kind of thing, I just think that's wrong. Exorbitant fees for late payments. A lot of that, boy, if it's not there on the first of the month, there's a fee on the first of the month because someone forgot or someone, it was in the mail and it didn't get there for some reason. The other thing is some landlords, they'll file an unlawful detainer, which is the start of an eviction, if on that first day that rent wasn't received. It's a real moneymaker for them, because then the tenant has to pay that. It's like, that is a racket. My leases say, hey, it's late if it's not there by the 5th day of the month. The late fee, according to my lease, is $30. But, I don't think I've ever charged it in all these years because, frankly, one, it's not helpful. Why wasn't the rent there? Well, one time, a single mom, and she'd been off sick for a week, so she didn't work as many days. And so we worked out a payment plan to get her caught up. And it didn't help to charge $30. It would help us to say, oh, well, gee, I can pay this much now. And, okay, great, because she'd been there a long time, and she and her kid weren't going anywhere. They were going to work this out. So I don't think late fees are very helpful. So you see here a checklist. If you require a damage deposit in Washington, you're required to have a checklist. They don't stipulate how to do it. You can take mine as one example. But the idea of a checklist is you have a list, so you walk through and you both initial it. The refrigerator is 3 years old, is good shape, but the vegetable bin is cracked. Or, the washer and dryer are brand new. Or the carpet is 5 years old, it's got a spot in the hallway we couldn't remove. You put all that in there. So when you do the damage deposit, then a year later you come back, oh yeah, that was cracked or this was damaged. And it just helps clear up a lot of things. That's very helpful. And when you have a damage deposit, you must return that within 14 days of the person leaving, and you must document any deductions from that from repairs that you made. And typically, I think people get 100% back because most things are just normal wear and tear, not too much to worry about. Couple of other questions. Let's see. Is it okay to ask for renter's insurance or require the tenants have renter's insurance? Yeah, I'm not aware there's anything that prevents you from asking for that. In my leases, I always write in there that I'm not providing you insurance or any coverage, nor are you providing any coverage for me. So if you want renter's insurance, you got to go get that. And I think it's a good thing for people to have renter's insurance if they get burglarized or whatever. What are considerations for a home share in leasing? So let's say you're doing that home share situation. You have a place and you're going to take on a roommate. Can they just move in? Yeah, you could do that. I'm always reminded about how you really test a friendship. Go on a long road trip and see how the friendship works out or the relationship works out on a long road trip. Maybe it's the same way if you take on someone with a roommate. If things go wrong, it's kind of like a prenup. You might want to have some sort of agreement in advance if there's some impasse you came to, how you would address it. And if you weren't able to address it, who would move out or how those things are dealt with. They just may save you some headaches down the road. And I think that's really the theme of writing a lease, to think of things that could happen and how we're going to, in a fair way, resolve it with as little grief as possible. Utilities. Of course, you want to have your tenants each on their own meter, particularly things like electric, that's fairly expensive, and water. If you're not able to divide them, people ask, well, gee, how do you divide that if you got, 1 meter for something and you got 2 units that are sharing that? You might do it on a square footage basis if one unit is a lot bigger than the other. Or you might say, gee, this unit has 1 person living in it, this one has 4. Would that help? I think there's no perfect way to do it, but it's really helpful to have it in writing in advance. So we say, this is how it is, it's what we're agreeing to. We know it's not perfect, but this is how we're going to do it. It's worth noting, too, in Port Townsend, on the water bill, the tenant has to, get permission from the landlord to put the water bill in their name. If they don't pay it, the landlord's responsible for paying it. So, of course, before you give the deposit back, make sure they've paid the last water bill payment because you are responsible. Another thing to be aware of is in state of Washington, utility bills are confidential. So sometimes you get an applicant that says, well, what's it cost for electricity here a month or water? And you can't tell them, you can't call the city or the PUD and get that information because it's confidential. Sometimes the previous tenant be willing to say, or you'd be able to point out some things that might be water saving features or energy saving features in the unit, but the bill itself is confidential. Well, people ask about insurance as well with, there's a thing called an umbrella policy. So if you're a landlord and you got a policy in each of your property, maybe the liability limit is $1 million, say, and if you had some horrific thing happen and you were sued and it was like, $2 million you're required to pay. If you have an umbrella policy, that would kick in once the whole $1 million coverage from the first policy was taken. So that might be something to think about. It's just a little belt and suspenders if something horrific happened and you were held liable for it. And the flip side of that is I always pay attention to things like hazardous materials and how the property is used and so on. You don't want fireworks stored there or too much propane or things like that. The other thing is home occupations. It seems like everybody in Jefferson County has a home occupation. I think they're great. Rather than making it complicated, like do I have to approve this or put it in the lease? What I say in my lease is look, if you can get a home occupation license from the city of Port Townsend, it's fine with me because that ordinance is designed to make sure that your home occupation is not a nuisance to neighbors. So if you get a license for it, it's okay to have that home occupation in my unit. Let's see, other things to really pay attention to: the state and federal requirements on mold, lead paint, smoke detectors, and carbon monoxide detectors. Even though you may think this unit has no mold or it's a newer house, it wouldn't have had lead paint, you're required to give those notifications, so don't skip it. It's a violation that you didn't give it, whether there's lead there or not, or mold. And you can download these forms online from the state and federal agencies involved. And it's very important to give that to the tenant. And equally important is what I put in my leases, which is to say, gee, you've been given notice of mold and lead paint and so on, but you're also required to inform me if you think you come across mold. Don't wait a year and tell me, well, gee, all this black stuff on the ceiling there, we didn't know what it was. Well, it was the leak from the roof that now it's gotten more expensive to fix. So I want to make sure the tenant is on notice that they need to say, hey, I think we've got a leaking pipe or something that's causing a problem. You want people to report those right away. Subletting, favorite topic. There's some tenants that think they're entirely in charge of who gets to live there. Hey, there's 3 of us here now. The one guy's moving out. This other guy's moving in. And I'm like, well, no, they're not. We make this decision together, landlord and tenants, by mutual agreement. But just as you spent effort screening the original tenants to make sure you've got someone who's reliable to be in there, hey, I'm happy to have this new person join, but I want to screen them as well and make sure that there's not an issue. You particularly want to make sure that their name and signature is on the lease so they are jointly responsible with the other tenants if there's damage. I don't know who to give damage deposits back to at the end. What about move out? All these things. So I'm always open to extinguishing a lease and starting a new one if someone moves out. You want to do for the 6 months that's left on the lease now, or do you want to do a new 12-month lease? You want to do something else? I'm open to all of those things to make that work. But never let people just move in there, because you can't, if they're not on a lease, you really can't hold them responsible for anything. And you may find out that the bills aren't being paid to the utilities and all kinds of headaches. So just be upfront with people, I think, be reasonable, and let the new person move in if they pass screening. The other thing, and the flip side of that, tenants can also break a lease. The one that it really makes just everyday sense. If you have substandard conditions in that unit and you have refused to fix those, the leaky pipe or the furnace doesn't work or some fire hazard, tenant's entitled to walk away. No responsibility for that. So you want to make sure you keep your place in good shape. The second one is domestic violence. Obviously, if there's a domestic violence situation, people need to move out to a new safe place. And the third one, very important also, is people that are in the military. If they get called up for active duty, they're allowed to get out of the lease, no penalty as well. Now, one of the additional websites that's on the syllabus is this Brink Law Group. I've never used them. I have talked to them there. I think they're pretty good at landlord-tenant law. They primarily represent landlords, although people I've talked to there said, the best summary of the state eviction law and the timetable is on the tenants' rights, tenants union website has a great table. So these are open-minded people, but their website also is very, very current on the changes that have been made in Washington State in the last 2 years or so on tenant landlord laws. So I think their site is really helpful. And people ask about evictions all the time, like they're commonly happen. I hope not. I've been doing this for many decades, and I think I've been lucky, but I've also really invested in screening tenants as well as treating tenants right, so people really, they want to stay there and they want to make things work. There have been some recent changes in the law where it's a little more even-handed than before in terms of legal fees being awarded to the prevailing party. It used to be that the potential fee that would have been assessed to the tenant was huge, so it wasn't a very fair process. I think that's been improved quite a bit. But if you really come to evicting someone, if that's the situation, someone because they're not paying the rent, or they're damaging the unit, or they're partying every night, disturbing all the neighbors, it really comes down to you're going to need a lawyer. You're not going to get much money back. You may not get any money back. But remember, the goal if you're evicting someone is to really cut your losses. Don't take it personally. If this person, let's get that person out of there. Yeah, you're going to have a cost of doing this, and you're not going to get the money back that you think you're owed, but at least you're moving on. And in fact, a lot of people, what they do instead of evicting, will actually offer a cash payment to a tenant to say, look, this doesn't work. We'll give you $1,000 to move out. No harm, no foul. That's easier than trying to evict someone. And that may be a thing to consider. So, and let's bring us up to the current situation with the pandemic. Last spring, Governor Inslee instituted a moratorium on residential evictions. It was originally set to expire on October 15th, but of course the pandemic hasn't expired and it's been extending, and so are these restrictions. And let me just summarize what they are. Essentially, there are no residential evictions allowed in Washington State at this time. There are 3 exceptions. The first one is if you can show that it is necessary to evict someone to respond to significant and immediate risk to health, safety, or property of others caused by the resident. You don't want to be in that situation, but if you are, that would be a justification for evicting someone under the moratorium. The second exception is if you're going to evict someone with 60 days notice so that you can move into the unit. Maybe you've been out of the country, you're moving back in, you can evict them on that basis. And the third one, according to the resolution, is you're going to give them 60 days notice so that you can sell the property. And I'm not sure how much they research that. And again, I'm not an attorney, but frequently when someone has a lease, if I was selling one of my rentals right now and had a lease on it, you'd want to disclose to the buyer that, hey, these people have a lease that hasn't expired and they come with the property, so to speak. That's the way I would take a look at it. But as the governor said in the proclamation, that he expects some of the details of this to be addressed by the legislature. And of course, this whole crisis is evolving. So that's in the works. But keep in mind, there's not only no evictions, there's no rent increases at this time. There are no late fees. There is no retaliation against tenants invoking their rights. And there's no rent due for when the tenant had no access due to COVID. I know what those words mean, but I'm not sure that anybody's figured out the nuts and bolts of it. Does that mean if you're in the hospital for 5 days that you don't pay rent for those 5 days? I don't know. But you can see the intent is to give relief for people who have been affected by this pandemic. Also, rent is not an enforceable debt unless a reasonable payment plan is offered. Enforceable debt is a legal term about certain things that are collectible. And what the governor is saying is, hey, you can't just pursue the payment of back rent under this moratorium. You must offer some reasonable plan to the tenant to repay it. So I think that's certainly a good attempt, but I think for a lot of mom and pop landlords, they could be out thousands of dollars a month, and for many of them, that's simply not going to be sustainable. So we'll see what happens on that. But that's our current moratorium. Let's see, and you've got my sample lease, a tenant application, and the attachments and so on. I used to do 2-page leases years and years ago, and that just doesn't work anymore. But the main thing is to be clear and comprehensive in the lease so that you've thought up the things that can come up for better and worse. So maintenance and operations, vacancies. Banks always like to talk about that when you apply for a loan, and they assume it's a 10% vacancy. That's more than 1 month's rent during the year. So it's a lot of money if your vacancy rate is that frequent. So this is, again, when you want long-term tenants and find that best tenant when you start and treat them right. What I find in this market, if somebody moves out on the 30th and I'm done fixing the place up by the 10th, I'll have plenty of people that will want to take it on the 11th or the 12th and not wait till the 1st of the next month. So that has worked well from the landlord standpoint. The thing I always try to do is for each of my 3 units, I have sort of a standby checklist, either written down or in my head about, if these people moved out tomorrow, gee, on that unit, that stove is, 6 years old now. I'm wondering what are stoves going for now? Maybe I want to replace that. Or gee, that carpet, it's had enough wear on it. You should get a new one. Or, I start thinking about those kind of things like, gee, that front door, is it better to paint it or should I replace it? But, you start thinking about those things in advance. And when someone says, yeah, I'm going to move out, before they're moved out, I've got my list kind of really fleshed out and say, geez, here's the materials I need, here's the tools, here's the tasks, because you really want to hustle and get that turned around because this is really important to get the place looking right as soon as you can. So being organized is helpful that way. Cash flow, there are those months when you write a lot of checks. So something to be prepared for. And that last month has been prepaid, so you're not getting rent that month. And then you're making repairs to the place, and then you're refunding a deposit. And then you get a new tenant with a new first and last and a deposit. I think it's a really good idea to have a home equity line of credit, a HELOC, because what the rule is about borrowing money. If you need money, you can't borrow it. If you don't need money, you can borrow as much as you want. So I have a HELOC on my own house because let's say the furnace went out and needs to be replaced. It might be a $10,000 or $15,000 project. Or what if you had a tree fall in the house and the insurance covered all but $20,000? It's really important to have that money immediately available so that you could fix that and move on. So it's a good belt and suspenders approach for all those uncertainties. Oh, and keep receipts for every expense. People aren't in the habit to throw receipts away today. Every time I go to the hardware store, before I leave the counter, I'm writing down which property it was and what it was for. Because at the end of the year, it's like Henry Hardware fasteners, $15. Now, what were those for? I have no idea. But you write it down on the receipt. Comes tax time, whether you do it or you have somebody do your taxes, it saves a lot of time. The other thing is if you get a cash payment, you are required by state law to give a receipt. But I think it's good to give receipts every time. You go down to the stationery store downtown, you get those little receipt books. And, always make a receipt. And if the person doesn't want it, they don't have to take it. But it keeps a good record because you sometimes forget, the rent was increased in July. No, it was June. Well, I can't remember. Well, if you got a receipt book, you remember. Or that month I gave them a one-day discount because the plumbing was out for half a day and just as a courtesy to the tenant. So it just makes your job a lot easier to have that receipt book. Yes, if they give you a check, you don't have to give a receipt, but it's a really good practice. And sometimes the bank will want to see what, and if you can show them, I almost never have vacancies, that helps you get the financing. So here's the IRS Schedule E, which is for, this is the one that's used by residential rental properties. It's good to take a look through this even if you don't do your own taxes. Read the instructions online to give you ideas about how these things work and to look at the form. There's really three kinds of expenses that you can deduct. First of all, there's the regular expenses like property taxes, mortgage interest. You cannot deduct principal, you can deduct interest, insurance, ordinary repairs, things like that. Then there's what we call 5-year items, like if you buy a new refrigerator or carpeting, let's say you spend $1,000 on a washer and dryer, you can write that off over 5 years, $200 a year. So those are 5-year items. There's a separate space for them in the forms. And then there's the basis, because you can't depreciate land. You can depreciate the basis, which is the structure and improvements. And if you're not sure how much value are the improvements versus the land, an easy way to do it is just to go to our own county assessor's website and you'll see their calculation. The land value is X, the improvements are Y, and you might make a very reasonable case, okay, I'll just take those same percentages and apply it. I think that would be a very rational approach, but again, I'm not licensed to give tax advice. I do love the concept of depreciation. It's a good reminder of the need to continually invest in something like real estate, that you don't just let it sit there. And the funny thing is, depreciation isn't well understood in terms of budgets. People don't realize no one ever writes a check for depreciation. But if you go down and look at the budget of Jefferson PUD or at some store downtown or the Port Townsend Paper Company, there'll be several lines of depreciation for different equipment. But no one writes a check at the end of the year that it depreciated. It's a recognition, though. It's a tax benefit, but it's also a recognition that, this thing is having its useful life and it's going to be replaced. And it's a reminder that you should be putting money aside for those things that will need to be replaced, those big ticket items like roofs and furnaces and stuff. And if you own a condominium with a homeowners association, a frequent problem is homeowners associations not wanting to put away enough money for the reserves. And then when the roof has to be fixed, they have to do a special assessment, a lot of money all at once to replace those things. So that's something to look out for with homeowners association. But even if it's just your own unit, think about what the schedule is for replacing things. What about doing your own maintenance? I got a couple of college degrees, but I'm handy. I like doing that stuff. In the state law in Washington, if you're a landlord, you can do residential repairs on your own units without being a licensed contractor. So that's good as long as you don't get in over your head. And it does save a lot of money to do things yourself. And I never assume that it's worth a premium to have a pro do something, although whenever I do drywall, I'm reminded about how much slower that I am than the people that can do drywall in seemingly one swoop. But hey, if I'm going to be working on a place for 3 weeks and it takes me 3 or 4 coats of drywall over 4 days, that's okay. It's cheaper than paying someone to do it. But if you think, I'm not really good at drywall, have that person come in and do it. I do a lot of my plumbing and electrical, but not all of it, partly because if the unit is occupied, I want to get in and out of there as soon as possible, and the pros are always quicker. And of course, they do a terrific job. And I keep on my cell phone, number for the plumber, the electrician. There's also a garage door guy. I go out, if I can't get a garage door going right away, it's like, no, call this guy and he'll get it going. Got a ditch digger on there. So you're not looking when those things happen, because you want to please that tenant. They called, we'll be out there as soon as we can, and we'll get this taken care of. So being organized helps, and being able to do a lot of things yourself is really helpful. Oh, this is a very good question. If you do your own repairs, can you write off your time as an expense? No, you can write off cost of materials, your mileage to and from the unit. And of course, for every plumbing job I do, I think it's 3 trips to the hardware store. That's the minimum. But you track those mileage, dump fees, all those kinds of things. But you can't charge for your time, and you also can't do a kind of a self-dealing transaction. You can't have like, Barney's rental units, and then you have Barney's maintenance company charging the other one, and can't do that kind of stuff. The IRS will frown on that, I'm sure. Let's see. Oh, how often do you do safety checks in your rental? Well, certainly when someone moves out, and then sometimes more frequently for things like fireplaces in the fall or propane, things like that are particularly more hazardous things. But on a general, if someone has moved out, there's a lot of things I'll do every time. Like you can get those cheap little electric socket testers. You plug them in. I check every single socket in the house to make sure it's still properly grounded. But the other thing I look for is, how annoying it is you plug in a vacuum cleaner and the plug keeps falling out of the wall. That ain't going to happen in my rentals. If one of those is broken, I replace that outlet. It's an easy job to do. And it's one of those things, you don't want a tenant to be just annoyed that every time you try to vacuum this room, the thing falls out. So fix that. It's also a safety hazard, but it's really good to replace it for convenience. I take the grills off of the wall heaters and a place where it has those cadet wall heaters, because dust can accumulate in there and that could be a fire hazard. So I check them. I put in the lease, tell the tenants to vacuum them, but then I just double check myself, get those. And of course you want to check all the water appliances, there's no leaks and so on. So you want to be really thorough on those things, especially when you have a chance to get in there and take your time when there's nobody living there and you can really inspect. What are the laws and best practices around entering the unit? How much notice you have to give? That's a really important question. And the state law in Washington says, other than in a bona fide emergency, you have to give the tenant 48 hours if you want to go over and do some maintenance or other work on it. I did have a bona fide emergency a couple of years ago where temperatures were in the teens and this tenant was out of the country, couldn't be reached by cell phone or by email. And I wanted to make sure the pipes were open so that the water line wouldn't freeze. So I texted him and said, I know you won't get this till you get back, but I'm heading over to your place to open the pipes up because I'm afraid we're going to freeze. We're like at 17 degrees. But on a regular thing, what I usually do is, depending if the tenant likes a call or a text, tell them, hey, I've got that new ice maker for you. When would be a good time to install it? And I say, could you come over such and such a day? And that's fine. So that always works out. And like this one tenant, I have, they work at the hospital, and I'll text her, hey, what about putting this? Oh, come by Thursday, I'll be at work, and I'll write that down. But when I head out there on Thursday, I try to remember that I may have forgotten or put down the wrong date, or she may have forgotten or put down the wrong date. So I'll text her, I'm on your way to your unit to fix that, to make sure you're not surprising people when you get there. And then when I leave, I might even send a picture of what I did. Okay, it's all done, thanks a lot. I think that's a really good way to make sure you don't, surprise people in their own place. So those are good questions. Let's see, we talked about IRAS, let's see. Oh, the cost and value of energy efficiency. I've thought about this topic a lot. Windows aren't always the biggest return on the money you spend. It's nice to have those double pane windows and so on, but it's not going to save you hundreds and hundreds of dollars a year. But, it's nice to have double pane windows. Appliances, if your current refrigerator is 10 years old, a new one might save a little more, probably not a lot. But the biggest bang for the buck, the no-brainer, is a new thermostat. How many houses do you see in town where it's the same old dumb thermostat? You set it at one temperature, and it'll stay that temperature unless you remember when you go to bed to turn it down and to raise it in the morning. $50, you can get a decent one that will have at least like 4 zones every day. That saves hundreds of dollars. And so for people that think, oh, I'll never remember to turn the heat off, it'll do it for you automatically. You can override it when you want to. The installation is very easy. And I'm talking about just the simple ones. You can get the more complicated one like a Nest where remotely you can decide, oh, gee, I'm coming home early, I want to turn the heat on so it'll be warm when I get home. But even the $50 one, put that in for your tenants. It'll save them a lot of money. It's a really good return. The other thing that's a low cost but a very high return on saving money from from cold is sealing leaks around windows and doors. Make sure those little door sweeps and things are not worn out. If they are, they're easy to replace. The other thing to look for is holes in framing. Whenever electricians or plumbers put holes in the top of a stud wall, they put it about 5 times the pipe that's going in. So if you ever go around up in the attic, you'll feel the cold air coming out by the pipes because all that air is coming through and making your unit colder. Get that styrofoam in a can at the hardware store, seal those things up, and you'll stop that air movement that's making your house colder. Those are all easy things to do. Another one worth looking at is these newer water heaters that have a built-in heat pump at the top. The heat pump isn't for heating your house, it's for heating the water in the water heater. So it's a small little heat pump on top. They don't work in a water heater closet if you have a small one of those, but it'll work if you have a 1-car garage or a 2-car garage. What it does is it leverages the heat in that room to heat your house. Now, if it's really, really cold, it'll rely more on its heating element, the traditional part of it, than the heat pump. But when it's using the heat pump, and I've verified this, you can save about $400 a year by having one of those. So it's really worth putting in. As I told my tenants when I was putting one in their place, it will be colder in the garage. You got to do the laundry in January, you'll notice it's a little chilly in the garage. That's because the heat pump is saving you money by taking that heat, putting it in your water. So that's a real money saver there. What else? Oh, electric baseboard heat. Of course, that's the least efficient heat, and it's the most expensive part of your power bill. If you have regular resistance heating wall, that's very expensive. Heat pumps, they're very expensive, but they are a really big turnaround. I know the PUD gives a rebate if you want to install a heat pump system. Most of those run $10,000 or $15,000, but so that's a lot of money. But like in this one place I have, it's like the furnace is older, it's propane, it's going to go one of these days. And when it does, hey, if you're going to spend that kind of money, get the one that's going to save the tenant money, get a little rebate from the PUD, and you're doing something good for the environment. Let's see, got a couple more things to cover here. Get to the home stretch. Water. It gives you a lot of headaches. It's something you really got to pay attention to. One thing that's handy to have is what's called a water key. It's like a wrought iron thing with a little U-shaped deal on the bottom of it. That's how you go out to your water meter box and you turn off the water. If you have an emergency in the house, you got a leak, you go out there and you can turn off that with just a half turn and shut the water off to the house. Now, the only problem, if you ever try to do this, you go out there, you may find the moles have filled up the water meter box with dirt. So bring a little shovel when you go out there and you can do it that way. Better yet is to have an interior shutoff valve on a water line. I've never bought a house in this town that came with an interior water shutoff. Now, imagine if your water heater starts leaking in the middle of the night in your pajamas. Do you want to get dressed and go out to the water meter box, dig it out, and put that key in there? No, you want a thing you can shut off. So you can put those in, plumbers can put them in, it's really easy. There's one place, I had them, there's a crawl space in this house. My elderly tenants, I don't want them to have to go down to the crawl space and look for a shutoff switch in the middle of the night in their pajamas. No, had the plumber run the line up under the kitchen sink. So if there's ever a leak, you open the thing with the garbage can and you just turn it, it shuts the water off. And then the second thing that's also very important to do is to then find the circuit breaker for the water heater and shut off the water heater, because if it drains and you leave it on, you got a fire hazard. So it's really worth having one of those shutoffs in, so when you have an emergency, you don't have to rush in the middle of the night. You can take care of it. The other thing to put in is what's called a PRV, or pressure reducing valve. Pressures vary depending on elevation and stuff where you're located, and often they're very high, and then somebody else is low. That's not as bad a problem. But if it's too high, you can wear out some appliances that are hooked up to your water system. So you don't want that. And a pressure reducing valve will set it to a safe pressure, so you're less likely to have a failure because of high pressure in the water system. Let's see. Oh, and the pressure relief valve on a water heater. There's normally a little valve on the top, and that's if the thing overheats and blows up, it goes out that way. Sometimes you see that someone hasn't hooked those up to the outside. Got to correct that, because if that thing blows, I had that happen at a college apartment years ago, and it just ruined the whole place, hardwood floors and everything, because that water comes shooting out of there. And if you're gone, like we were, everything's ruined by the time you get home. So you want to make sure that's piped to the outside to minimize the damage. Another tip people don't always think about, when you install a toilet, do you put caulking around the base of the toilet or not? Some plumbers don't caulk at all. Some people will caulk, but then leave a little gap at one point. And the reason for this is really important. If the wax seal between the toilet and the pipe fails, water will start to come out, and you want to see that the water is coming out. You say, oh, I got a problem to fix. If you have it sealed all the way around, that water sits in there and rots the floor out. So maybe 5 years later, you go to change the toilet, and it's rotted because there was water in there, but the toilet base was caulked, and you never saw it. So that's a good preventive thing. Oh, and on water meters. You look in the water meter, you see these different gauges. The one that's most important is a little red arrow that circles. Every time it goes one rotation, that's a gallon. So you know you got a leak if you have everything shut off and that thing is turning. Now, I went out to check a place. The guy was moving out, and we kind of did a walkthrough with that checklist and saw what was there. And we were in the garage. It's on a slab floor, and I thought, man, it's been raining a lot recently. He just drove his car in here. The car is wet, but it just seemed really damp. I said, is it normally this damp? I don't recall. Oh, no. Don't know. All right, so after he moved out and doing all his work, I did the water meter. It was spinning, and it turned out that there was a leak in the water line, which was under the slab floor. So it was good to find that out because, you know, the water bill was higher. This guy was just paying the bill, but I had to replace that line. I wasn't going to dig up the slab floor. We had to run another line in, but it's really good to check that thing to find out. So you want to do that. You want to clean your gutters and downspouts, make sure they're direct away from the foundation. And finally, some of those good practices, things that make people say, God, I want to take this unit. And I ask you this, why do so many rental bathrooms look like they're a bathroom on a gas station at the freeway? No excuse for that. It shouldn't remind people of that. It should look nice. Because even if it works okay, no one wants to clean an old toilet. You go to the store and look to buy a new toilet, you'll see dozens of them up on the rack there. Most of them, $5 says, they were designed by people who have never actually cleaned a toilet. Because if they had, they wouldn't put all those nooks and crannies on the base. They would have a smooth base. Because you're the person cleaning those. It's just so much easier to do it that way. There are a few made that way, and they're not really any more expensive than other toilets. Why not buy one that's easy to clean? You want the low flow, of course, but you want a nice sturdy one, comfort height, self-closing top. I put in, I'm not necessarily recommending, but ones I've used recently, the American Standard Clean model. Smooth base, it's very sturdy as well, and that one has worked really well. But even when you have a new toilet in there, I have the new tenant, new toilet seat rule, which is when someone has moved out of a unit, it's $15, it's 15 minutes. Get new toilet seats. If someone comes in there and says, yeah, the bathroom's clean, but the seat's crooked or it's missing one of the little bumpers on it, for crying out loud. Give people a nice new toilet seat. This is going to be their house for a year or two. You want it to be nice for them. Handicap bars, as I mentioned, are really smart to put in. They're not that hard to do. And God, if you redo a shower, and I've done a couple of these, but I've seen this mistake made by other people doing walk-in showers. Do what I did, which is you put the control valve over here. So whether you're in a wheelchair or whether you are an able-bodied person, you can set the temperature here, okay, I got the temperature right, then you walk under the shower. But you always see the temperature control valve under the shower. Don't do that. That's a mistake. The garage, spend a few extra dollars to get a good garage door opener. By that I mean one that's got a battery backup. There's a power failure and your tenants are coming home late at night, at least the garage door opens, even if they don't park inside. It opens, it's lit, they can get into the house without fumbling around in the dark. It doesn't cost that much more, and those better garage door openers come with a little keypad you can mount on the outside so you can enter it without having a little clicker. Put a few lights in the garage, not one just skinny little light bulb at the top, but put in a couple of lights out there so people can use the space. A lot of garages aren't insulated, they aren't drywalled. That's an easy job, most people can do that work. You do that, put some shelves up, people can actually use the garage and they'll really appreciate it because they have stuff to put out there. Washer and dryer, if they're out there, put a hanger pole out there. I have hanger poles that I put out on a chain so you bump your head, you don't hurt yourself. But when you're taking stuff out of the dryer, don't you need to hang it up? I mean, I'm a bachelor, but I got the hang of it. You got to hang your clothes up and they come out of the dryer. Give those little things for people. And decent light fixtures. How often do you see those really cheap light fixtures in the living room or bedrooms of a rental unit? Gosh, for $10 or $15, you can get much nicer fixtures. It's an easy job to do. Nothing says cheap rental like a really cheap light in the ceiling. And put in LEDs. Your tenants may never have to change a light bulb. and you check all those plugs. Add a dimmer switch in the dining room and in the kitchen. If you're replacing cabinets, I see this all the time. Why do you want to leave space between the top of the cabinets and the ceiling? It collects dust, it collects grease, and if you can buy the longer length cabinets, they are a little bit more money, but people will use those top shelves for the occasional things that they use. They'll never use just that leftover space that collects dust that I, the landlord, have to clean. If people move out, even though they do a clean job, I go up there and make sure to get all the grease out because it'll smell better. So those little things make a big difference. Oh, in a kitchen, you can change your outlet of the kitchen counter. Put in the ones that have those USB built-in things when people need to charge something. It's right there. It's convenient for them. So, in a nutshell, stuff breaks. People are human. The only thing you can control is your attitude. You're going to have high maintenance tenants. You're going to have low maintenance tenants. You're going to fix a lot of stuff. You're going to put up with a lot of stuff. Clean a lot of stuff. But like I said, that story about that tenant, people have low expectations, so putting a little effort in goes a long way. I think the key to success, like with anything else you do in life, is treating people right. But you know that's why you're here. And I want to thank the Housing Solutions Network for their effort in addressing housing opportunities in Jefferson County. Thank you very much.